Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization. It's February 8th, 2021. This is your morning update, and it's going to be today a little different. I'm going to do an obituary of sorts. George Pratt Shultz passed away on Saturday. Shultz was one of the most important architects for the whole globalist free trade system, which is presently crashing around us. And perhaps this system will pass away along with him. But I'm going to review his history for you to get a sense of what he represented as one of the real models for the idea of an economic hitman. And it will also go a long way toward dispelling the myths of left, right, socialist, communist, Nazi, to show that there is a common interest, or a commonality, you might say, between so-called communist and Nazi policies. Now, what you're going to see is a lot of laudatory obituaries of him, that he was a man of honor, that he worked in many administrations, he was a teacher, a diplomat, but let's look at the real history. And to start, you have to go back to the 1930s, when the United States was becoming aware, after the rise of Hitler, the chaos developing with the Civil War in Spain, other developments in Europe, the rise of fascism and the threat of communism. Roosevelt had a team looking into what was going on. And they came up with this term, which is an old French term, of synarchy, which refers to the intersection of so-called communist and Nazi ideologies. And essentially what they wrote about was that there was an intersection between the two. That in Germany, for example, in the period leading to Hitler's takeover of power in 1933, you had an open door going between left and right. One day people would march with Nazis, the next day with communists. What was the whole point here? The point was a total disruption of society. The idea to create diversions and chaos. And eventually they used the Reichstag fire as the excuse for emergency decrees for a top-down dictatorship. And that was the model. If you look at Shultz's career, he was a synarchist, neither left nor right, but a corporation man, a corporatist, because the original term for fascism was corporatism, the running of society by interlocking boards of international corporations operating over and above sovereign nation states. In other words, no sovereignty. That sovereignty got in the way of the corporate need for cheap markets, cheap labor, and control of currencies. And that's what Shultz represented, an economic hitman on behalf of corporate cartels. Now his father, this is part of his heritage. His father was Burl Shultz. He worked for a period of time at the American International Corporation, which was a Morgan Rockefeller company, had its headquarters at 120 Broadway, which is where you had a collection of these financial interests that were involved in shaping the policies in Europe and the United States. In particular, if you think about the Harriman-Prescott-Bush alliance, which worked with Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, to put Hitler in power. This is what you're talking about. Corporate cartels directing policy. That was Shultz's father. Now, Shultz himself, after the World War II, went to MIT, where he came under the influence of Kurt Lewin, an operative of the Tavistock Institute, which is a mind control center. What Shultz studied at MIT with Lewin was how to use various methods to cause workers to speed up so they could cheapen the cost of labor. How do you manipulate people to do things for the benefit of their employers, not for their own benefit? This was his idea of free market economics. So naturally, after he left MIT, he went to the University of Chicago, where he fell under the influence of Milton Friedman and his free market school. Now, if you look at his career, he ended up in the Nixon administration. And he was on the scene and important in the decision made in 1971 in August to break apart the Bretton Woods system, to remove the gold reserve of the dollar, and to set up floating exchange rates. Now, many people will say, well, wait a second, that was John Connally who did that. Connally was the Treasury Secretary. But I spoke to John Connally when he was auctioning off his worldly goods because he went bankrupt in the mid-1980s. And I asked him about what happened on August 15th, 1971. And he said, well, it was my idea. And I said, well, you realize that was a bad idea. That free market policy, the floating exchange rates, the break of the dollar with gold, created the economic boom-bust cycle that cost you your family fortune. And Connally said, whoa, wait a second, it wasn't my idea. And what he laid out in that discussion is that it was Paul Volcker, it was Arthur Burns, who was another close friend of Shultz, former Federal Reserve Chairman, and Kissinger and George Shultz. And he said especially Shultz, who convinced Nixon to break the Bretton Woods system. Now, at this same period of time, or shortly afterwards, Shultz was one of the overseers of the coup in Chile, which overthrew an elected government of Salvador Allende and put in a military dictatorship under General Pinochet. And when this happened, years later, in reflecting on it, Shultz said, well, Pinochet, this is a quote, no doubt did some unnecessarily brutal things, like killing people, rounding up especially young people, taking them to a stadium and assassinating them. They carried out assassinations, killings, and they imposed a hardcore, deregulated free market system, which collapsed the Chilean economy. And it still hasn't really recovered from that period. This was done through the bringing into Chile of the Chicago Boys, and this was Shultz and Friedman's team. Now, there's a whole lot more that can be said about him. Just to give you a couple of the highlights, when he was in the Reagan administration, he was one of the leading promoters of the Thatcherite free market deregulated economy, which paved the way for the bubble systems, the bubble economies, and the crashes of 1987, 1999, and 2000, 2008, and the present one today. This is all Shultz's policy. In 1999, when he was at Stanford, he pulled together a group which became known as the Vulcans. This included the basic team which became the Bush Jr. administration. He vetted George W. Bush and approved of him and pulled together the cabinet. In 2003, he did the same thing with Arnie Schwarzenegger, working with Lord Jacob Rothschild to promote Schwarzenegger coming in from completely the outside to take over California, which had been, its economy had been shattered. Why? Because of the free market deregulated electricity policies of Enron, which crashed the California economy at that time. And then after that, he went into something called the Revolution in Military Affairs. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief picture of that, but if you want to get more, you can go to the Executive Intelligence Review, which you can find on LaRouche Pub, and the December 10th, 2004 issue has a very lengthy article on Shultz and his policies. Now, what did he do in 2004? He worked with a man named Felix Rohatyn, who came from a French financial firm that was promoting synarchy, namely Felix Rohatyn from Lazard Frères. And Shultz and Rohatyn pulled together teams to push what they called the Revolution in Military Affairs. This was essentially a move to privatize national security, explicitly modeled on the British East India Company and its role in the rise of the British Empire. That is, you bring in private contractors to fight the wars, to benefit from the money from the wars. The reality of this is what Lyndon LaRouche warned about in August 1971. It's Hjalmar Schacht. It's the corporatist policy of Schacht, again, over and above governments. Now, what Rohatyn and Shultz pushed, among other things, was private-public partnerships. This was not to build infrastructure. It was to loot infrastructure, to privatize infrastructure for personal profit of private interests, underwritten by government money. Now, the conference that they had in Middlebury in October 2004 was titled Privatization of National Security. Now, this was Rohatyn and Shultz were the sponsors of the conference, but this became the policy of Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense under Bush and Cheney, a grouping that we called the Children of Satan. Under the umbrella of the global war on terrorism, which remember was another Reichstag fire type false flag, the idea of 9/11 that this was a bin Laden operating out of a bat cave in Afghanistan and that Saddam Hussein somehow played a role in this led to the regional wars that have continued to the present day. Endless wars. Get rid of sovereign states. Have privatized national security agencies deploy forces, including government militaries, but increasingly through privatized operations, so that you outsource security to multinational corporations. Now, does this sound familiar? This is a model for what we're seeing today with the Great Reset. So that's why I think it's important to look at the career of George Shultz and realize that what we're seeing today, by the way, Shultz was also a great proponent of environmentalism, even during the Reagan administration. So here's a man who is in the establishment, who made his way into so-called conservative Republican circles, pushing the mantra of free market policy, free enterprise, but for what purpose? For corporate cartels to take over the power of government, to drive down wages, to deindustrialize, to seek the cheapest labor costs around the world, and to benefit from the bubbles that are created by their control over monetary policy. And that's what would go on steroids with the Great Reset. Now, just a footnote on this you might find interesting. While we're talking about the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, it's been reported in the last days that Queen Elizabeth and the royal family will make hundreds of millions of pounds from their control through the Crown Estate, which manages her real estate holdings, of areas on offshore where wind farms are being created, that they get 25% of the offshore lease money for the wind farms that are now being constructed as part of the British policy for the Green New Deal. So we have to defeat this Green New Deal, but to defeat it, you need to know that it's not just a bunch of lefties running around who don't bathe and oppose the idea of nuclear power and coal and oil and gas. It's a policy of the corporate cartels that's connected to their desire to reduce world population. That's who George Shultz was. That's his legacy. Hopefully we can bury that legacy with him. Thanks for being with me today, and I'll see you again tomorrow.